With reaction to the Latin Mass liturgy controversy and the ongoing push for synodality under Pope Leo, I'm joined by the Papal Posse, editor-in-chief of the CatholicThing.org, Robert Royal, and canon lawyer and priest of the Archdiocese of New York, Father Gerald Murray. Gents, I want to get your reaction to those new developments Diane Montagna brought to us. Father, then Bob, your thoughts on Matteo Bruni's insistence that the leaked document was only one of many pieces of information. As you heard from Diane there, then maybe we need to see more of this.
I agree, Raymond. Yes, this press conference response was obviously damage control. It was an attempt to kind of like say, well, what was revealed, not sure if it's true, but if it is, but then on the other hand, it's only partial. No, it was an accurate report of what the bishops told the Holy See. Now, if the Holy See got other information from bishops that contradicts that, then we need to know that, because otherwise we're left with the problem, because Pope Francis said he got the report from the CDF regarding what the bishop said, and it troubled him and saddened him because it revealed great damage being done to the church by the traditional Latin Mass permissions, and that's why he was going to restrict them. So, yeah, this damage control will not solve this issue. If there are other documents that make their case, they need to be made public.
Yeah, Bob, Pope Benedict had brought a certain peace to the Valley when he gave wide permission to celebrate the traditional Latin Mass. Summorum Pontificum had calmed the liturgy wars. You had the old rite, you had the new rite. I guess the question is, why did Pope Francis feel that manipulating the truth or lying about this survey was necessary, particularly when he had ultimate authority to do whatever he likes?
Yeah, look, it's puzzling, of course, and I think that question that you also asked Diane is the key question here. I think the reason why he would want to do it is he had staked his entire papacy on this idea of synodality. And we know that synodality is a hard thing to define, but if it means anything, it means consulting with one another, listening to one another, respecting one another, getting input from one another. And so I think when he asked that survey to be done, he thought that what he was going to get back was what he wanted to do, which was to limit the availability of the traditional Latin Mass. That didn't happen. And in fact, if you look at the numbers, as Diane and others have reported, only about 20% of the bishops even bothered to respond. Most of them didn't, they weren't troubled enough or they weren't moved enough even to reply to the Pope. But those 20%, as Diane said, pretty much made it clear that it would produce more harm than good to go on to something else. Now, Leo is really confronted here, and I'm glad Diane used the word justice, because that's the term I would use here, because lots of people have been harmed in their deepest ways of worshiping on Sundays. And they were harmed in a way that was based on an untruth. So Leo's got an obligation here. I want to point out that this past week, he announced, along with further things about what's going on in the synodal process, that there is going to be a further study group that is going to look at liturgy, and it's supposed to give a report, I think, to him in December. So I think Diane may not be right that we'll get something in the fall. But certainly he's put that on the agenda, perhaps to stimulate a real consultation about where we stand with these two different forms of the Western Rite. And if we get the right people debating that, maybe we'll get some resolution of this injustice.
Yeah, well, Father, there's the key question. If you get a balanced consultation, but will we get a balanced consultation, given the way the synodality, these synod structures have been formed in the past? They kind of got burned early because they brought a wide consultation in and found conflicting voices that said, we don't want to go down this synodal path.
Yes, and you'll recall, Raymond, that for the last Synod on Synodality #2 last October, about 10 important topics were taken off the table because they were given to expert committees. And those expert committees, their reports were due in June. Now they're going to be due in December. Two more expert committees, as Bob mentioned, being formed. This kind of is confounding. How can you say we're going to consult the people of God in a synodal setting and then basically turn it over to the in-house experts? And that's what we've gotten here. who are they? And many of the committees, we do know who's on it, but for instance, the doctrinal committee that's going to consider female diaconate, whether that's acceptable, which it isn't, but that they're looking at it, those committee members, we don't even know who they are. Who is going to pick the people on the liturgy committee? There's another one on canon law that's been formed. So again, we already have a structure of committees. It's called the Roman Curia. Their job is to do all these things that's being repeated by the synodal committees. I hope and pray that this thing gets whittled down, because it's spiraling out of control into bureaucratic control of the church.
Yeah, well, this is a good segue to synodality remaining a constant in this new pontificate. Some thought it might be dialed down. It doesn't appear that way. The General Secretariat of the Synod issued a new document on the ongoing implementation of the Synod on synodality this week. And in that document, Pope Leo announced the creation of, as Bob mentioned, yet another study group, this one, quote, on the liturgy in a synodal perspective. Not sure what that means. Also this week it was announced that the deadline for those established synod groups would be extended to the end of the year. Father, what do you think this new study group on the liturgy from a synodal perspective means? And do you agree with Bob? Is this going to be kind of is it an opening to re-examine the liturgy? And if the Pope needed to do that, why does he need to have a study group to do that? He can do that on his own.
Well, it's mysterious, that you would have study groups to study matters that were not brought up earlier. The Pope has an interest in them, but why are they in? I guess it means that everything now forward has to be looked at in a synodal perspective, which is, again, a strange thing, because what is the synodal church? The church is one holy, Catholic, and apostolic. Synodality is a minor aspect of how the church governs herself. But now it's become like, a fifth mark of the church. In that document that you referred to that the Synod Committee just issued, it talks about building a synodal church. That's a terrifying statement. We don't build any church. The church is given to us by God. And within the church, we use governing structures which reflect the nature of the church, it's an apostolic church. It's not based on getting all the sheep together and gathering their opinions. It's based on the shepherds conveying the message of Christ. So it's troubling that all of these things are continuing.
Bob, we are on this path to not only synodal implementation, but institutionalization of the Synod. Sister Natalie Beckwart, who's the Undersecretary of the General Secretariat of the Synod, flat out said this week, synodality is really Vatican II in bloom, essentially. It's the realization of Vatican II, because you just didn't get it. John Paul II and Benedict must have been asleep while, they were attending the council, because now we're seeing the real council come forward. It seems this revolution in church decision-making is continuing.
Yeah, I think that that's true, and I think that regrettably, Sister Natalie is trying to shoehorn Vatican II, which is it's a controversial council in many ways. Of course, we've been debating it for 60 years, but it is not one simple thing. There are some very good things that have come out of Vatican II, scripture studies and whatnot. There are some other things that are much iffier, and so to try to make it appear as if Vatican II is basically synodality, I don't see this as bearing any relation to reality whatever. And in terms of these study groups that we're talking about now, okay, I think we shouldn't forget that these are groups that will present results to the Holy Father, who can either accept them or he can reject them. He can look at what the so-called experts who have been assigned to these different committees, these study groups, have come up with. But he's the one that has to make the decision. So, look, in some ways, as we know, I live in Washington. We know that committees or study groups are things that really put off having to make a decision. And the fact that these deadlines keep getting set back farther and farther means somebody doesn't want to have to, take the bit between his teeth and make a decision. And maybe that's what's happening with some of the other ones. But about liturgy in particular, which is the way that people worship, we have a group of people who've benefited from this traditional Latin Mass, and not everybody has. Nobody makes you go to the traditional Latin Mass. You choose to go there. You benefit from it as long as you respect others. Benedict always used to say, let us allow the largest diversity possible within the parameters of the Orthodox tradition. That's the diversity within unity that the Catholic Church seeks to practice.
Father, that thing you mentioned earlier keeps lingering in my mind. As Bob was talking, I kept thinking about it. What we're really, and just so everybody understands, I feel so bad for Pope Leo because it's like he's been dropped in the middle of this new structure that Pope Francis put into place, and it is an innovation. We have to say it. A synod of bishops is when bishops come together and give the Pope their opinion. This synodality is everybody, lay people and nuns and atheists, everybody and their dog coming in and having a say. What position do you think, he's put in because of this synodal, pre-existing synodal structure? And what does it mean now that they're saying, hey, it's coming to every parish and every diocese now? It reminds me of Little Shop of Horrors at the end when the little plants start showing up. Here we come for you. You know, it's everywhere. You can't get away from it.
Well, no, this is a profound shift, this synod on synodality. Well, number one, back to Vatican II. Vatican II created the Synod of Bishops, and then it was implemented afterwards by Paul VI, and it was a meeting that happened every 2 or 3 years. And then the meeting was over, and then they brought up a new topic the next time. Now this is going on. It's become a process, and they talk about it in such ways. And now we're getting detailed instructions for further meetings, and they're going to have assemblies and dioceses, nations, and continental. But, the interesting thing is apparently the synod's not good enough because they've canceled the one for 2028, and they're replacing it with something called the Ecclesial Assembly. So they announced a new structure at the universal level of the church, but they didn't tell us what it is, who's going to be part of it. The unofficial word coming here and there as well. It's going to be, similar to assemblies that were held earlier where you got lay people and priests and deacons and bishops and everybody together in a big room. For me, this looks like they're building up to what they would call Vatican III, only they'll call it the real Vatican II, only realize now where lay people are sitting there with bishops making decisions. And this is horrific because it contradicts the hierarchical nature of the church. Now, Pope Leo can define and orient synodality in a proper and orthodox sense if we return to the source, which is Vatican II. Because, it's quite clear the Synod of Bishops is a synod of bishops. And bishops were not chosen by the people. Bishops are successors of the apostles, and they receive their office, and they're ordained, and then they're sent out to govern the flock. Not the other way around.
Yeah, Father, it's also quite clear that, if we want to have a definitive ruling, and Bob mentioned this a moment ago, if you want a definitive ruling on female diaconate or a married priesthood, you got popes who've been signing off and opining on this for centuries, including the last two guys who said, case closed. Church has already decided this. It can't happen. Why not just quote them and move on? This whole idea that we're studying and we're opening and you come in, it leaves the door open, and it sends out the signal that somehow doctrine and practice is up for grabs if we just wait long enough. And that I find as a Catholic troubling. Bob, I'll give you the last word on this.
Yeah, it's interesting that Pope Francis is regarded by many people as a progressive. There are elements in his papacy that are clearly in that direction, and there are others that are more traditional. And a lot of the people who expected a great deal from him were saying openly that they were disappointed when he died. And so what we have, I think you're exactly right, Raymond. It goes to the point that this document that just came out this week says we have to take all points of view into account, including the people who dispute the very idea of synodality. That's really something to say, that we haven't really seen that element taking place officially within the process that they now have, which is a very, very managerial kind of approach to things. But I'll tell you, my blood ran cold when I read one sentence. It's worth actually looking for this. They say that we have to look at the resistances and the obstacles, including our own resistance to this process. So it's a kind of almost, I don't know, ideological training of people that we're supposed to look at ourselves and say, because we have resistances, there's something wrong with us? No, maybe that there's something that has to be asserted about the way that the church is functioning. And I hope that Leo, he's trying to, I think, introduce a different tone or a different spirit about this synodality. But the very root of this is very, very troubling, and I hope they look very carefully at that as as the process goes forward.
Yeah, we'll obviously keep watching this, but it is troubling when you focus on exactly what's happening. You know, beyond the words, beyond the committees, and beyond all the kind of surface talk, it's a replacement of papal authority. That's really what it is. It's an expansion and a hijacking of papal authority. Father, a couple of curious developments by bishops this week. One in the Czech Republic. The other in the Diocese of San Bernardino, California. The bishop in each diocese has ruled to suspend Sunday obligations to attend Mass. In the case of the Czech bishop, he's lifting the obligation because of the shortage of priests and the burden it can place on Catholics who have long commutes to a parish to get to Mass. In the case of San Bernardino, Bishop Alberto Rojas has made the decision to dispense the Sunday obligation due to the fear many in his flock have of ICE raids. Bishop Rojas has been a frequent critic of the administration's immigration enforcement methods. And Father, I guess, are these legitimate reasons to suspend obligation or the obligation to attend Sunday Mass? And or is this political grandstanding in a way?
In the case of the Czech Republic, there's no need for this because you're only obligated to go to Mass if there's a Mass available for you to go to. There's no obligation. The obligation falls if you can't get to it, and that's up to people to judge. For some people, older folk, having to walk a mile to church, it's impossible, and they just can't do it. No one expects them to go. They're not under that obligation. On the other hand, young people, why not walk the mile instead of the 30 or 40 yards if you live next door to the church? So that's superfluous, I think. As regards San Bernardino, it's a curious thing that the bishop has done, because law enforcement is not wrong per se. It's not wrong to enforce just laws. So if people are afraid that they're going to be deported because they're illegally in the country and they're the target of an enforcement action, why is that entering into the question of whether they should go to Mass or not on Sunday? People are conscious that they, are subject to law enforcement. The better thing to do is voluntarily surrender and then have an orderly process for their deportation. And that's, people who enter the country illegally, they know when they come in that there's a risk of them getting deported. So it's not like this is an unjust surprise that, being imposed on them.
Yeah, Bob, I mean, it begs the question, will suspected mob leaders and celebrities get Mass dispensations too? I mean, they might be harassed or arrested at Mass as well. Where does this end?
It's an interesting way of putting it, Raymond. Yes, I mean, it's clear that this is a kind of almost a virtue signaling, except I can't imagine what the virtue is here other than a kind of a political stance that this particular bishop wants to take. I mean, there are all sorts of reasons for criticizing what our government does, but to take a group of people and tell them that they don't have to respect the idea of keeping holy the Lord's Day because they came illegally and broke the law here in the United States, it doesn't make sense to me.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think there's something off here, and then where do we draw the line? What other people, what other Catholics who, are in violation of the law that showing up at Mass might make them a target? I mean, come on. And speaking of politics, the USCCB has spoken out against President Trump's big, beautiful spending bill, despite the fact that it contains a very significant piece of pro-life legislation, the defunding of abortion giant Planned Parenthood. For 1 year, all Medicaid funds are barred from Planned Parenthood. Now, that's in addition to any funds going to them for abortion services. Despite the provision, the USCCB president, Archbishop Timothy Broglio, issued this statement. My brother bishops and I have repeatedly and consistently urged lawmakers to use the budget reconciliation process to help families in need and to change course on aspects of the bill that fail the poor and vulnerable. The bill as passed will cause the greatest harm to those who are especially vulnerable in our society. Father, then Bob, who's more vulnerable than the unborn?
The unborn threatened with death, and when the government paying for it, they're the ones who need to be protected. Unfortunately, this confirms a trend that we've seen, throughout my lifetime, which is that the bishops endorse in these broad terms the Democratic Party agenda, which essentially is geared toward a welfare state mentality. And when he talks about taking care of the poor and vulnerable, well, the bill's goal is to increase economic output and thereby to make economic opportunity available for more people. Whether it achieves or not is a secondary matter. But the bill is not designed to hurt poor people. It's designed to promote economic liberty in this country. That's certainly a value we should think about. But yes, if you're stopping the funding of Planned Parenthood, which has been a nightmare, evil policy of our government for decades, we ought to stand up and rejoice and give thanks to the president.
Yeah, Bob, a judge, by the way, just placed a restraining order on that clause to show you that it does have teeth in it after Planned Parenthood sued the government because they want their Medicaid dollars. I'll give you the final thought on this.
Yeah, our bishops even cite statistics, and well, we always know that numbers are not everything when it comes to these moral questions. But if you talk about endangering people, that people will die because of cuts, so-called cuts in this big, beautiful bill. And by the way, as we know here in Washington, cuts never mean cuts. And in fact, in this particular case, what it means is that the growth of the spending is going to be slightly less than it would have been otherwise. Now, Father rightly raises this question. There are larger moral questions in here too. I mean, if the financial system, if the economy of the United States tanks because of these tremendous deficits that we're running, then we'll really see some destruction of the poor, because all of our safety net programs and whatnot are going to be in peril as a result of that. And look, the simple matter is, the question of abortion is this: 1 million children, more or less, given the year, are killed every year in the womb because of abortion. There is nothing else like that happens in the United States that is the result of what the government allows to happen or makes happen. Globally, abortion is the #1 cause of death in the world. There's 65 million abortions every year in the world. So if our bishops really wanted to be serious about what the most pressing threat to human life is, it's abortion. There's no debate about this. The numbers confirm it, and everybody knows it.
Robert Royal, Father Gerald Murray. We will leave it there. For more commentary from Robert and Father Gerald, visit thecatholicthing.org. And don't miss the Prayerful Posse, dropping Friday on the Arroyo Grande Show YouTube channel or wherever you get your podcasts. We're going to get into the new Mass Pope Leo celebrated this week and some news on those blessings of gay couples by the Church. Don't miss that.